the specter of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered the Holy Alliance to hunt down and exorcise this specter. Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals and German police spies. Where is the party in opposition that has not been denounced as communistic by opponents in power? Where is the opposition that has not hurled back the branding reproach of communism against the more advanced opposition's parties as well as against its reactionary adversaries? Two things result from this fact. One, communism is already acknowledged by all European powers to be itself a power. Two, it is in high time that communists should openly, in the face of the whole world, publish their views, their aims, their tendencies, and meet this nursery tale of specter of communism with the manifesto of the party itself. To this end, communists of various nationalities have assembled in London and sketched the following manifesto to be published in the English, French, German, Italian, Flemish, Danish, and whatever languages there are. Now we're heading into section 1, bourgeoisie and proletarians. I'll go, John Gray goes next. We'll go this way.
The history of all hitherto existing society is a history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stand in constant opposition to one another, carried on and uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes.
If you pass it along next to whoever, or read one, everyone reads one paragraph. I have a paragraph.
In the earlier epochs of history, we find almost everywhere a complicated arrangement of society into various orders, a manifold gradation of social rank. In ancient Rome, we have patricians, knights, plebeians, slaves. In the Middle Ages, feudal lords, vassals, guildmasters, journeymen, apprentices, serfs. In almost all of these classes, again, subordinate gradations.
The modern bourgeoisie society that has sprouted from the ruins of feudal society has not done away with class antagonisms. It has but established new classes, new conditions of oppression, new forms of struggle in place of the old ones.
Our epoch, the epoch of the bourgeoisie, possesses, however, this distinct feature. It has simplified class antagonisms. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, into two great classes directly facing each other, bourgeoisie and proletariat.
From the serfs of the Middle Ages sprang the chartered burghers of the earliest towns. From these burgesses, the first elements of the bourgeoisie were developed. The discovery of America, the rounding of the Cape, opened up fresh ground for the rising bourgeoisie. The East Indian and Chinese markets, the colonization of America, trade with the colonies, the increase in the means of exchange and in commodities generally, gave to commerce, to navigation, to industry, an impulse never before known, and thereby to the revolutionary element in the tottering feudal society, a rapid development.
The feudal system of industry under which industrial production was monopolized by closed guilds now no longer sufficed for the growing wants of the new markets. The manufacturing system took its place. The guild masters were pushed on one side by the manufacturing middle class. Division of labor between the different corporate guilds vanished in the face of division of labor in each single workshop.
Meantime, the market kept ever growing, the demand ever rising. Even manufacture no longer sufficed. Thereupon, steam and machinery revolutionized industrial production. The place of the industrial middle class, the industrial millionaires, the leaders of the whole industrial armies, and the modern bourgeoisie.
Modern history has established a world's market for which the discovery of America paved the way. The market has an immense development from this to navigation to communication by land. This development has in turn reacted to the expansion of industries, and a proportion of industry, commerce, navigation, and railways expanded. In the same proportion, the bourgeoisie evolved, increases capital, and pushed into the background every class handed down from the Middle Ages.
We see, therefore, how the modern bourgeoisie is itself the product of a long course of development, of a series of revolutions in the modes of production and of exchange.
Each step in the development of the bourgeoisie was accompanied by a corresponding political advance of that class. An oppressed class under the sway of the feudal nobility, an armed and self-governing association in the medieval commune, here independent urban republic, as in Italy and Germany, there taxable third estate of the monarchy, as in France. Afterwards, in the period of manufacturing proper, serving either the semi-feudal or the absolute monarchy as a counterpoise against the nobility, and in fact cornerstone of the great monarchies in general, the bourgeoisie has at last, since the establishment of modern industry and of the world market, conquered for itself, in the modern representative state, exclusive political sway. The executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie.
The bourgeoisie historically has played a most revolutionary part. The bourgeoisie, wherever it has the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. It has pitilessly torn asunder from the motley feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors, and has left remaining no other bond between man and man than naked self-interest and callous cash payment. It has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism in the icy waters of egotistical calculation. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value, and in place of the numberless, indefeasible charter freedoms has set up in that unconscionable freedom, free trade, in one word, for exploitation built by the religious and political illusions. It has substituted naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation.
The bourgeoisie has stripped of its halo every occupation hitherto honored and looked up to with reverent awe. It has converted the physician, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science into its paid wage laborers.
The bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its sentimental veil and has reduced the family relation to a mere money relation.
The bourgeoisie has disclosed how it came to pass that the brutal display of vigor in the Middle Ages, which reactionists so admire, found its fitting complement in the most slothful indolence. It has been the first to show that man's activity can bring about. It has accompanied wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals. It has conducted expeditions that put in the shade of all former exoduses of nations and crusades.
The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. Conservation of the old modes of production in unaltered form was, on the contrary, the first condition of existence for all earlier industrial classes. Constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeoisie epoch from earlier ones. All fixed, fast, frozen relations, with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions, are swept away. All new formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with somber senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind.
The need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the whole surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere.
The bourgeoisie has, through its exploitation of the world market, given a cosmopolitan character to production and consumption in every country. To the great charter of reactionists, it has drawn from under the feet of the industry the national ground on which it stood. All old established national industries have been destroyed or are daily being destroyed. They are dislodged by new industries whose introduction becomes a life and death question for all civilized nations. By industries that no longer work up indigenous raw material, but raw material drawn from the remotest zones, industries whose products are consumed not only at home but in every quarter of the globe. In place of the old ones satisfied by production of the country, we find new ones requiring for their satisfaction products of distant lands and classes. In place of the old interdependence, old local and national seclusion and self-sufficiency, we have intercourse in every direction, universal interdependence of nations. And as in material, so also in intellectual production. The intellectual creations of individual nations become common property. National one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness become more and more impossible. And from the numerous national and local literatures, there arises a world literature.
The bourgeois, by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production, by the immensely facilitated means of communication, draws all, even the most barbaric, nations into civilization. The cheap prices of commodities are the heavy artillery with which it batters down all Chinese walls, with which it forces the barbarians' intensely obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate. It compels all nations, on pain of extinction, to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst, i.e., to become bourgeois themselves. In one word, it creates a world after its own image.
The bourgeoisie has subjected the country to the rule of the towns. It has created enormous cities, has greatly increased the urban population as compared with the rural, and has thus rescued a considerable part of the population from the idiocy of rural life. Just as it has made the country dependent on the towns, so it has made barbarians and semi-barbarian countries dependent on the civilized ones. Nations of peasants on nations of bourgeois, the east on the west.
The bourgeoisie keeps more and more doing away with the scattered stage of the population, of the means of production and of property. It has agglomerated production and has concentrated property in a few hands. The necessary consequence of this was political centralization. Independent, or but loosely connected provinces with separate interests, laws, governments, and systems of taxation become lumped together into one nation, with one government, one code of laws, one national class interest, one frontier, and one customs tariff. The bourgeoisie, during its rule of scarce 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together. Subjection of nature's forces to man, machinery, application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraph, clearing of whole continents for cultivation, canalization of rivers, whole populations conjured out of the water, what earlier century had even a presentiment that such productive forces slumbered in the lack of social labor.
We see then the means of production and of exchange on whose foundation the bourgeoisie built itself up were generated in feudal society. At a certain stage, the development of these means of production and of exchange, the conditions under which feudal society produced and exchanged, the feudal organization of agriculture and manufacturing industry, in one word, the feudal relations of property, became no longer compatible with the already developed productive forces. They became so many fetters. They had to be burst asunder, they were burst asunder.
Into their place went free competition, accompanied by a social and political constitution adapted to it, and the economical and political sway of the bourgeois class. A similar movement is going on before our eyes. Modern bourgeois society, with its relation of production, of exchange, and of property, a society that has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange, is like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the power of neither world whom he has called by his spells. For many a decade past, the history of industry and commerce is the history of the revolt of modern productive forces against modern conditions of production, against the property relation that are the conditions for the existence of the bourgeois and of its rule. It is enough to mention the commercial crisis that, by their periodical return, put on its trial each time more threatening the existence of the entire bourgeois society. In these crises, a great part not only of the existing products, but also of the previously created productive forces are periodically destroyed. In these crises, there are breakout of epidemic that, in all earlier epochs, would have seen in absurdity the epidemic of overproduction. Society suddenly finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarism. It appears as if a famine, a universal war of devastation, had cut off the supply of every means of substance. Industry and commerce seem to be destroyed. And why? Because there is too much civilization, too much means of substance, too much industry, too much commerce. The productive force at the disposal of society no longer tend to further the development of the conditions of the bourgeois property. On the contrary, they have become too powerful for these conditions, by which they are fettered, and so soon they will overcome these fetters. They bring disorder into the world of the bourgeois society, endanger the existence of the bourgeois property. The conditions of the bourgeois society are too narrow to compromise the wealth created by them. And how does the bourgeois get over these crises? On the hand, by enforced destruction of mass productive forces. On the other hand, by the conquest of new markets, and by more throughout the exploitation of the old ones. That is to say, by paving the way for more extensive and more destructive crises, by the diminishing of means whereby these crises are prevented.
The weapons with which the bourgeoisie followed feudalism to the ground are now turned against the bourgeoisie itself. But not only has the bourgeoisie forced the weapons that bring death into itself, it has also called into existence the men who are to wield those weapons, the modern working class, the proletarians. In proportion as the bourgeoisie, for example, capital, is developed, in the same proportion is the proletariat. The modern working class develops a class of laborers who live only so long as they find work, and who find work only so long as their labor increases capital. These laborers, who must sell themselves piecemeal, are like a commodity. Like every other article of commerce, they are consequently exposed to all the vicissitudes of competition, to all the fluctuations of the market.
Owing to the extensive use of machinery and to the division of labor, the work of the proletarians has lost all individual character and consequently all charm for the workman. He becomes an appendage of the machine, and it is only the most simple, most monotonous, and most easily acquired knack that is required of him. Hence, the cost of production of a workman is restricted almost entirely to the means of subsistence that he requires for his maintenance and for the propagation of his race. But the price of a commodity, and therefore also of labor, is equal to its cost of production. In proportion, therefore, as the repulsiveness of the work increases, the wage decreases. Nay, more, in proportion as the use of machinery and division of labor increases, in the same proportion the burden of toil also increases, whether by prolongation of the working hours, by increase of the work exacted in a given time, or by increased speed of the machinery, etc.
Modern industry has converted the little workshop of the patriarchal master into the great factory of the industrial capitalist. Masses of laborers crowded into the factory are organized like soldiers. As privates of the industrial army, they are placed under the command of a perfect hierarchy of officers and sergeants. Not only are they slaves of the bourgeoisie class and of the bourgeois state, they are daily and hourly enslaved by the machine, by the onlooker, and above all by the individual bourgeois manufacturer himself. The more openly this despotism proclaims gain to be its end and aim, the more petty, the more hateful, and the more embittering it is.
The less skilled and exertion of strength implied in manual labor, in other words, the more modern industry becomes developed, the more is the labor of men superseded of that of women. Differences in age and sex have no longer any distinctive social validity for the working class. All are instruments of labor, more or less expensive to use according to their age and sex.
No sooner is the exploitation of the laborer by the manufacturer so far as an payment that he receives his wages in cash, then he is set upon by other portions of the bourgeoisie, the landlord, the shopkeeper, the pawnbroker.
The lower strata of the middle class, the small tradespeople, shopkeepers, and retired tradesmen generally, the handicraftsmen and peasants, all these sink gradually into the proletariat, partly because their diminutive capital does not suffice for the scale on which modern industry is carried on, and is swamped in the competition with the large capitalists, partly because their specialized skill is rendered worthless by new methods of production. Thus, the proletariat is recruited from all classes of the population.
The proletariat goes through various stages of development. With its birth begins its struggle with the bourgeoisie. At first, the contest is carried on by individual laborers, then by the work people of a factory, then by the operatives of one trade in one locality against the individual bourgeoisie who directly exploits them. They direct their attack not against the bourgeoisie conditions of production, but against the instruments of production themselves. They destroy imported wares that compete with their labor. They smash to pieces machinery. They set factories ablaze. They seek to restore by force the vanished status of the workmen of the Middle Ages.
At this stage, the laborers still form an incoherent mass scattered over the whole country and are broken up by their mutual competition. If anywhere they unite to form more compact bodies, this is not yet the consequence of their own active union, but of the union of the bourgeoisie, which class, in order to attain its own political ends, is compelled to set the whole proletariat in motion and is moreover yet, for a time, able to do so. At this stage, therefore, the proletarians do not fight their enemies, but the enemies of their enemies, the remnants of absolute monarchy, the landlords, the non-industrial bourgeoisie, the petty bourgeoisie. Thus, the whole historical movement is concentrated in the hands of the bourgeoisie. Every victory so obtained is a victory for the bourgeoisie.
But with the development of industry, the proletariat does not only increases in number, it becomes concentrated in greater masses. Its strength grows and it feels that strength more. The various interests and conditions of life within the ranks of the proletariat are more and more equalized in proportion as the machinery obliterates all distinctions of labor, and nearly everywhere reduces wages to the same low level. The growing competition among the bourgeois and the resulting commercial crises make the wages of the workers ever more fluctuating. The increasing improvement of machinery, ever more rapidly developing, makes their livelihoods more and more precarious. The collisions between individual workmen and the individual bourgeois take more and more the character of collisions between two classes. Thereupon, the workers begin to form combinations, trades unions, against the bourgeois. They club together in order to keep up the rate of wages. They have found permanent associations in order to make provisions beforehand for these occasional revolts. Here and there, the contest breaks out into riots.
Now and then, the workers are victorious, but only for a time. The real fruit of their battle lies not in the immediate result, but in the ever-expanding union of the workers. This union is helped on by the improved means of communication that are created by modern industry, and that place the workers of different localities in contact with one another. It was just this contact that was needed to centralize the numerous local struggles, all of the same character, into one national struggle between class. But every class struggle is a political struggle, and that union, to attain which the workers of the Middle Ages, with their miserable highways, required centuries, the modern proletariat, thanks to railways, achieve in a few years.
This organization of proletarians into a class and consequently into a political party is continually being upset again by the competition between the workers themselves. But if ever rises up again, stronger, firmer, mightier, it compels legislative recognition of particular interests of the workers by taking advantage of the divisions among the bourgeoisie itself. Thus, the 10 hours bill in England was carried.
Altogether, collisions between the classes of the old society further, in many ways, the course of development of the proletariat. The bourgeois finds itself involved in a constant battle. At first, with the aristocracy, later on, with the portions of the bourgeoisie itself, whose interests have become antagonistic to the progress of industry. At all times, with the bourgeois of foreign countries. In all these battles, it sees itself compelled to appeal to the proletariat, to ask for help, and thus to drag it into the political arena. The bourgeoisie itself, therefore, supplies the proletariat with its own elements of political and general education. In other words, it furnishes the proletariat with weapons for fighting the bourgeois.
Further, as we have always seen, entire sections of the ruling class are, by the advance of industry, precipitated into the proletariat or at least threatened in their conditions of existence. These also supply the proletariat with fresh elements of enlightenment and progress.
Finally, in times when the class struggle nears the decisive hour, the process of dissolution going on within the ruling class, in fact within the whole range of society, assumes such a violent, glaring character that a small section of the ruling class cuts itself adrift and joins the revolutionary class, the class that holds the future in its hands. Just as, therefore, at an earlier period, a section of the nobility went over to the bourgeoisie, so now a portion of the bourgeoisie goes over to the proletariat, and in particular, a portion of the bourgeois ideologists who have raised themselves to the level of comprehending, theoretically, the historical movement as a whole.
Of all the classes that stand face to face with the bourgeoisie today, the proletariat alone is a really revolutionary class. The other classes decay and finally disappear in the face of modern industry. The proletariat is its special and essential product.
The lower middle class, the small manufacturer, the shopkeeper, the artisan, the peasant, all the fight against the bourgeois, to save from extinction their existence as fractions of their middle class. They are therefore not revolutionary, but conservative. Nay, more, they are reactionary. They try to roll back the wheel of history. If by chance they are revolutionary, they are so only in view of their impending transfer into the proletariat. They thus defend not their present, but their future interests. They desert their own standpoint to place themselves at that of the proletariat.
The dangerous class, the social scum, the passively rotting class thrown off by the lowest layers of old society, may, here and there, be swapped into the movement by proletarian revolution. Its conditions of life, however, prepare it far more for the part of a bright tool of reactionary intrigue. And the conditions of the proletariat, those of old society at large, are already virtually swamped. The proletariat is without property. His relation to his wife and children has no longer anything in common with the bourgeois family relation. Modern industrial labor, modern subjection to capital, the same in England as in France, in America as in Germany, has stripped him of every trace of national character. Law, morality, religion are to him so many bourgeois prejudices, behind which lurk in ambush just as many bourgeois interests.
All the preceding classes that got the upper hand sought to fortify their already acquired status by subjecting society at large to their conditions of appropriation. The proletarians cannot become masters of the productive forces of society except by abolishing their own previous mode of appropriation, and thereby also every other previous mode of appropriation. They have nothing of their own to secure and to fortify. Their mission is to destroy all previous securities for and insurances of individual property. All previous historical movements were movements of minorities, or in the interest of minorities. The proletarian movement is the self-conscious, independent movement of the immense majority, in the interest of the immense majority. The proletariat, the lowest stratum of our present society, cannot raise itself up without the whole superincumbent strata of official society being sprung into the air.
Though not in substance, yet in form, the struggle of the proletariat with the bourgeoisie is at first a national struggle. The proletariat of each country must, of course, first of all settle matters with its own bourgeoisie. In depicting the most general phases of the development of the proletariat, we trace the more or less veiled civil war raging within existing society, up to the point where that war breaks out into open revolution, and where the violent overthrow of the bourgeoisie lays the foundation for the sway of the proletariat. Hitherto, every form of society has been based, as we have already seen, on the antagonism of oppressing and oppressed classes. But in order to oppress a class, certain conditions must be assured to it under which it can, at least, continue its slavish existence. The serf, in the period of serfdom, raised himself to membership in the commune, just as the petty bourgeois, under the yoke of the feudal absolutism, managed to develop into a bourgeois. The modern laborer, on the contrary, instead of risking or rising with the process of industry, sinks deeper and deeper below the conditions of existence of his own class. He becomes a pauper, and pauperism develops more rapidly than population and wealth. And here it becomes evident that the bourgeoisie is unfit any longer to be the ruling class in society and to impose its conditions of existence upon society as an overriding law. It is unfit to rule because it is incompetent to assure an existence to its slave within his slavery, because it cannot help letting him sink into such a state that it has to feed him instead of being fed by him. Society can no longer live under this bourgeoisie. In other words, its existence is no longer compatible with society.
The essential condition for the existence and the sway of bourgeoisie class is the formation and augmentation of capital. The condition of the capital is wage labor. Wage labor rests exclusively on the competition between the laborers and the advance of industry, which involuntary promoter is the bourgeoisie, replaces the isolation of the laborers due to competition. By the revolutionary combination due to association, The development of modern industry therefore cuts from under its feet the very foundation on which the bourgeoisie produces and appropriates products. What the bourgeoisie therefore produces above all its own grain figures. Its fall and victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. So that was the end of the first section. We're gonna go into a 20-minute discussion. Can someone timekeep?
How long?
20 minutes.
But I haven't read it.
Okay, so you're wondering, why are we reading this book? Can anyone from what we've read make any connections to this book to what is happening in the current day?
Yeah.
I mean, our labor is being exploited. I'm assuming all of us here are proletariat. Yeah. But just how we exist today, we're not seeing any of the benefit of our labor, be it making whatever we're making or just the time we put into our jobs. We are seeing merely a fraction of what the ruling class, which they are way more powerful today than they were when Marx wrote this. And they're stealing way more than they ever were before.
I think another thing too is we can kind of look at our time now as I noticed, like one of the things that Marx was saying was that you get to a certain point in history when the ruling class is now unable and the people see that they're unfit to rule. And I mean, if you look at just macro things, you recognize, okay, the world, what's it called? Age expectancy is going down. We finally reached this point in history, and for a lot of people it's been at that point, since the beginning of America. But for the vast majority, for the masses, you've reached this point in which the bourgeoisie aren't actually improving our lives. There's a point in capitalism where they are, expanding production, expanding access to medical care, housing, electricity, plumbing, and such. But we reach the point where the system is so bloated and just overripe for revolution that conditions are actively getting worse, even amongst the first world, and even amongst the bourgeoisie themselves. I guess I kind of want to put this question to the group then, of just in Hawaii, who are the bourgeoisie?
I guess I would think it's all the CEOs, the people who came from the mainland, obviously, and are taking, I guess, our land, and either it's foreign investors maybe who are just using this land and then necessarily aren't part of our communities, or maybe they are here, but why are they here, I guess.
Some of the language is hard to read because it's these civilized nations and these uncivilized nations. But that provides a really useful foundation. I almost said groundation like the band, but foundation to analyze the relationships of the first world and the third world, or the first world and the fourth world. Largely people from outside of Hawaii who are exploiting this sort of colony, this something that can be extracted from endlessly, that the state of the bourgeoisie doesn't have to necessarily invest too much into.
Something that Marx also didn't have to encounter is the military-industrial complex, which we are subject to here. And I think that I am the child of a federal worker here, and I would consider federal workers to be the bourgeoisie, regardless of whether they work for the military or another branch, for sure.
Anyone else have another question?
Not a direct answer, but just an interesting thought is that only was overthrown by the bourgeoisie, like specifically business owner class, the gold, all those guys. They were all. This is very precarious.
Precarious.
I don't know. Sorry. But yeah, just the relation of the bourgeoisie, because how this was directly overthrown, this kingdom.
I think I'll add on to what John said. Yeah, especially with like the Committee on Safety and stuff, Queen Liliuokalani was in prison, and while there was a rebellion that was trying to fight against these forces, the Wilcox Rebellion as well. So you have to think. Thinking back to when that part where Marx was like saying that, oh, we're building the weapons for the fighting against the bourgeoisie. So how do we escape that? Or how do we become free? That's another question.
Speaking of weapons, I guess this would be like a type of weapon, just knowledge in general. We have methods of communication that didn't exist back then and are able to connect with every corner of the globe in like an instant. But this face-to-face and personal connection is something that is never goes outside of this. It's definitely one weapon and one that strengthens communities. Sure.
And especially in the age of social media and stuff, this over-reliance on meta social media platforms, all of these social media platforms that are trying to sell you AI, trying to sell you these products, trying to sell you the solutions and stuff like that. The solutions is not being bought. We are not buying solutions. We have to keep on creating solutions as we go on, as time goes on. Because we can't keep doing the same old stuff. We have to combine the old and the new together, synthesize these things, and keep on going. Keep having conversations.
I guess adding on to technology, I was thinking about how maybe our technologies can be compromised and maybe used against us. I'm thinking a lot of the bots that are on Meta that are maybe sowing discourse, or people that are infiltrating social movements on purpose to decrease their effectiveness, I guess. I don't want to interrupt.
Oh, come on in.
Got the chair over there. Or there.
Just raise a warning, that might fall down.
Yeah, just
Yeah, we're all straight.
I think something that's interesting, because I'm not very well read in this, so it's refreshing, but the idea of what he says at the end, the existence of the bourgeois is predicated on its capacity to fail, and that it does inevitably fail. So I think that even though, and something I think about a lot that is not comparable to maybe prior centuries, is the way that the global ruling class has accelerated the physical collapse of our climate and of the ability to live on this planet, and the way that then proletariat spaces in the third world, the fourth world are pushed into these sacrifice zones of the bourgeoisie in a way that was not happening on the same magnitude previously. But despite all that, I think that it is it's heartening and it's heartening to read. But just that something I try and think about a lot, and whenever I feel myself kind of gravitating towards this mindset of oh my god, the world is ending, is the world has ended so many times, for my ancestors, for so many people's ancestors, there's no, the most horrific things that humans could do to each other have already occurred and are continuing to occur every day. And so I think in the first world, this sense of waiting for these things to happen more directly or more outrageously we just see every day part of like our kind of consumer culture and the global scale of it now, I think also makes things less shocking to us in the first world, like increasingly. So I think just like, you know, it's grounding to look at history and look at the ways that people have thought about prior revolution and survived the collapse of their societies as manufactured intentionally by the bourgeoisie, but you know, they've rebuilt from that. And part of our role within like a global movement is to kind of try and establish a permanent rebuilding that means that people can continue to like survive on this, like literally survive on the planet. So yeah.
Now, I'm trying to answer your question, specifically for nonprofits where managers / supervisors don't get paid a living wage for them and their kids. I mean, is that still, that's like petty bourgeois, but like, they don't get paid shit. So like, I don't know. I just have questions about that, I guess.
I think more. So I think, you know, the authors of this also struggle with like trying to identify where does the bourgeoisie start and the proletarian begin, right? Like they talk about how the, you know, tradesmen of the previous epochs sort of are collapsing into the working class or into the proletariat, even though they're not maybe day laborers or they're not wage laborers. And I think, as somebody mentioned, you know, like income inequality is even greater now than it, well, and even, not even income inequality, really, like capital inequality, right? Because we're not even talking about people with income, we're talking about people who like make money on their money, right? Like, so they don't even have like a salary. So I think that now more than ever, right, we're looking at, and we don't typically use or hear the words as much in like modern or in everyday use. We hear like words like working class, right? And there's always a question of like, well, what is the working class, right? Because there's a very different idea of, you know, people who are in the middle class who are, you know, they work hard, but they're okay. They're making enough to get by, and then like people that really are not, or even that's in America, and then we zoom out globally, like there are people living on less than $1 a day, right, in a lot of places because of colonization and the way global capital moves. So I don't know, I think it's hard to struggle with that, and I think when I think about that, you kind of also have to think about how people are choosing class alliances for themselves, right? Like those people have an opportunity to struggle with the proletarian, or maybe try to align themselves and probably be fucked over by the bourgeoisie, right? But not to say that, you know, we should abandon those people because they've made a choice and whatever, but I think that there's always been a really unclear line, and we have to like kind of, you know, there's a difference between a person who is your supervisor, your manager, or even like the CEO of a nonprofit, and people like, you know, Larry Ellison who thinks he owns the entire island and will not be right.
You would.
Oh, so I was going to say, I think that part of our issue is that we, in the 1800s, Marx could not even think of how much exploitation we would face today. And the level of destruction and warfare and lawfare that happens in our globe today is at a scale that is truly unprecedented, like, even in history, even with everything that has happened. When Joe Biden was president, the cabinet discussed dropping a bomb on Ukraine, and they modeled it. They modeled the entire globe. They saw what would happen. What would happen if they dropped a nuclear bomb in Ukraine? You know what they discovered? They discovered that 75% of all agriculture on Earth would collapse. And they still deeply considered doing it. So I think that we're in an age where class alliances are really important. How you identify and where you put your efforts really matter, but also the 1% is is powerful enough and is willing to do enough that the relation between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat are a money-making game, and they're a game to pit us against each other. But how the bourgeoisie chooses their alliances doesn't matter because the 1% is planning to kill them anyway.
Oh yeah, this sort of speaks to like anthropogenic like climate change and like the idea that like who are our enemies, and like I think something that Marx wasn't exactly privy to, and there's an entire like academic like genealogies of academic like study coming off of this, but just like the shift away from like and this is really Foucault like sort of like discipline and punish, but like how the world has shifted from like sovereign like very explicit expressions of power, like I'm going to punish you as the state and you are going to die, to like like we're operating sort of like soft power, like restorative, or like the sort of like basic what were, I forget like the language that was used, but the price of like survival wages, but like intellectually and culturally, like the U.S. running the East-West Center at UH Manoa, and then sending like everyone to all of these different places, or nonprofits that exist to like meet needs that capitalism will never be able to like satisfy, and then that nonprofits will always be like at deficit, or like and then it also gets even more complicated when you begin to think about those wars between bourgeois interests, like the war between the capitalist Russia and the capitalist America, or the capitalist China and the capitalist America, and then all of the factions within that. It gets tough, but those contradictions, as we've read, are inherent to capitalism and eventually bring about its end. But the end of how much, right? Like,
I guess moving into like the modern, I was thinking about Luigi and how even if he is part of allegedly what he did, even if he's part of the higher class, like finally tensions in privatizing basic things like healthcare have gone to the point where even the rich can't really afford healthcare, or it could sort of end their lives to have one bad medical emergency, I guess. Yeah, I guess I'm just wondering like how that line crumbles, because like I think most people would consider Luigi to be pretty wealthy.
Well, and I think we've discussed, and I think we're all aware of a lot of the shortcomings in Marx when it comes to the global South and her perception of Black and brown people around the world. And I think that part of what we're facing right now is not just the increasing pressure that the bourgeoisie and the empire is feeling, but also the absolute economic and environmental devastation that the global South is facing, with the increase not just in the temperatures and the irregularity of storms, but also a decrease in those aid programs. Even though those nonprofit programs are just band-aids, they still provide resources to people, and as they are defunded, those people then starve and go without water. Exactly, yeah. And so I think that we are seeing, in a sense, the collapse of the system, and if it will be reborn in its worst form, I don't know if we know that, but I think we are witnessing, in a sense, these contradictions in real time.
Yeah, I also think too that the kind of like conservative and reactionary huge forces around, like globally, that we see are a result of those like the kind of self-collapse of capitalism. And I think, if you look at like the large left-wing movements that happened in the 40s and 50s, and then going back to like the 30s and 40s too, like a lot of them are dead. And it's really sad to see that, like these massive communist parties or labor unions and stuff, since, the era of neoliberalism, have collapsed in on itself. But it is heartening to see, though, that even without those huge forces of, progressive, being pushed onto the ruling class, that the bourgeoisie is actively eating itself. And but it's really scary too, because it's, you have this kind of, petit bourgeois reactionary element to it. The masses see, they don't see the option of moving forward. They see progress now as a negative thing, because it's consolidating more and more power into the hands of the bourgeoisie. rather than, it could be progress for us as the working class. But they instead turn to conservatism and reactionary politics because they say, well, things weren't great 20, 30 years ago, but at least they were better then than they are now. And so what we need to do, I think, as the left is present that unifying and progressive message of saying that we as a working class can move forward. We don't need the bourgeoisie. We're not trying to go back in history. Like, things are actually pretty shitty during the 90s. Things are really, really shitty during the 50s, And so it's like we have to, like, instead of saying, well, we need to harken back to these systems of old, and not to say we shouldn't, draw on and look to inspiration from forgotten and, purposely obscure histories, but we need to present our message to the working classes. We're moving forward. And we're, throwing off the chains of old. We're destroying the old systems of oppression and moving forward.
I think we could go into 5-minute break so we can all just move around for 5 minutes.
Okay.
So it's in the back. Yeah.
I think so. It might have a little
Yeah,
bit
you can turn it down.
of
Yeah, we're looking it on our, if you don't have a copy, we're looking it on a PDF.
Let's do it. Let me, Alex, make this.